These are the most controversial changes that the live-action One Piece made from the anime and the manga. Changes between mediums are inevitable. In fact, even changes between the manga and the anime sometimes end up being quite controversial, and they're practically a one-to-one translation. But here are things that people are saying. The first controversial change is Roger's death, namely that we actually see it. This is interesting because never before in any of the One Piece have we seen the moment where Roger dies. It's usually like a dramatic cutaway or even a non-dramatic cutaway. To start off with the pros of this change, it immediately sets the tone for live-action One Piece. It tells us that this is not the series we know, and it's going to go in its own direction while still remaining mostly true. As an existing One Piece fan, this is the first moment where you go, oh, alright, this is gonna be a ride. But also there are arguments against it. Roger is a character who is larger than life. His presence is always felt in One Piece. And even 20 years after his death, the legacy of the Pirate King is what has shaped the world we see today. So actually seeing Roger die does risk reducing him to the status of mere mortal. Because our last image of him isn't this deity smiling gloriously, it's of the life slowly draining out of his very, very human face. Again, we've never seen his death in the anime or even the manga, and I think there's good reason. In fact, it's not even clear between mediums exactly what was used to kill him. The execution implements and methods often change, and in fact, so does the time of day and even the weather. Roger's execution has been depicted on a bright sunny day, as well as a dreary rainy day, which I think only furthers the legend. It's sort of like listening to the stories of how the Joker got his scars. How did the Pirate King die? Well, you see, no one's quite sure, because everyone tells the story slightly differently. And really, the live action does contribute to that. It's another different retelling to add to the Roger pile. Next up, Octopus. There's a few missing characters in live action One Piece, but the one you'll see called out most often is Heart-chan, also known as Hachi, with Hachi being his nickname and Heart-chan being his real name, which I have to point out because otherwise people are going to be all up in my comments. But Heart-chan is an octopus fishman and an officer of the Arlong Pirates along with Kurubi and Chu. And during the Arlong arc, Heart-chan serves the very, very important role of being defeated by Zoro. Now, as much as it pains me, I can't blame the live action for not including him, because the fishermen look like they were a hard enough challenge as it is. So trying to make one work with 6 arms using 6 sword style would be a nightmare no matter which way you went, practical or CGI. But in a very recent interview, showrunner Steven Maeda went on to explain exactly why Heart-chan needed to be cut.
What do you think you could have been better, and how do you think season 2 can improve on it?
A lot of things are solved by budget. There's always more that we wanted to do and couldn't afford. And I have been bringing up, for example, the character of Hachi. Boy, did I want Hachi in the show. And we had a whole fight between Hachi and Zoro set up. I couldn't do it. And that's no one's fault. It's just a matter of time and money. It would have been so time intensive and so expensive to do that. So those are things, that I hope can make it into the show at some point. The bigger ticket items like that.
Here's the thing though, Hachi is technically in the live action, but you wouldn't know that just by watching it. The credits for episode 7 list an actor named Jared Norman playing Hachi/Angry Fishman, which refers to this guy playing poker with Nami in the beginning. I say playing, I mean losing, hence the angry, and Nami beats him with a hand containing 2 4s, which is a direct reference. His nickname Hachi is Japanese for number 8, and unless my maths has failed me, 2 4s come together to form a mighty 8. So technically Heart-chan wasn't cut, but he effectively was. And this has some pretty massive impacts for the future, because in retrospect, Heart-chan is actually the most important member of the Arlong Pirates, because Heart-chan goes off on his own journey, meets a mermaid and a starfish, and eventually ends up setting up shop at Sabari Archipelago. And when the Straw Hats get there, it's a pretty big moment when the crew decide to help Heart-chan in need. And an even bigger moment when, after they make friends, Heart-chan is the catalyst for a very, very big decision that Luffy makes. A decision to do with fists and faces. So who are they going to replace him with? Chu or Kurubi maybe? Well, actually, according to this behind the scenes photo, Kurubi seems like a pretty nice guy. So yeah, maybe. Why not? Another pretty big alteration is how Luffy actually eats his devil fruit. And it's an interesting change because it doesn't not work. Originally in the manga, Luffy is established as an omnivore. He's a very energetic little boy man who is always hungry and will eat seemingly anything. So during the scuffle with Higuma the bear, Luffy continues to eat, and having run out of food, he finds this weird fruit in a chest and decides to eat that while no one's watching him. In live action, Luffy actually has a bit more motivation to eat the fruit. It's not explained during the scene where we see it happen, but the idea is that he consumed Shanks's most precious treasure. So maybe that now makes him the most precious treasure, ? I know, the logic isn't amazing, but also he's a child. It doesn't have to be amazing. But this change is less controversial and more just fascinating. Because if you're up to date with the story, it actually makes perfect sense. Because there's something very special about this devil fruit. Much more special than any of the other magical fruits. Something that explains why Luffy would be drawn to it and consume it with seemingly little motivation. The thing is, I think it works either way, so why did they make the change? Well, I think it's simply to give Luffy eating the fruit a moment of focus. Because in the original series, it's more of an afterthought. Alright, this next one's a big one. Probably the single greatest change in the show, which is the Battle of Baratie. Or I guess not that, because it didn't happen. It cannot be understated just how much cutting this conflict changed One Piece. For some context, do you remember this pirate in the live action? The guy who Mihawk used to metaphorically wipe his very posh ass with? Well, his name is Don Krieg. And in the anime and the manga, he is the big antagonist of the entire Baratie arc. After being chased out of the Grand Line by Mihawk, Don Krieg arrives at the restaurant and decides that he's going to commandeer the floating vessel and add it to his fleet. And this is originally how Luffy gets out of being a chore boy for a year. He makes a deal with Zeph to defeat Don Krieg. And in the live action, I'm not sure if it's ever actually explained how Luffy got out of his year of service, but this is a pretty large-scale affair. Don Krieg, in terms of military might, was actually the most powerful pirate in East Blue, so he essentially brought a small army to Baratie, which was met with the formation of a resistance group comprised of the combat-trained chefs of the restaurant. It's probably the largest scale conflict of the East Blue saga. The battle at Arlong Park looks quite cute in comparison, but that's why it had to be cut. Filming this whole battle would have been shockingly expensive. So many set pieces to destroy, an army of extras, and the biggest expense is actually time. With an 8-episode series, we just do not have the time for any prolonged conflicts. That's why fights in the One Piece live action are generally very short. To put what was lost into some context though, the Baratie arc is 27 chapters long, or 12 anime episodes, and the Battle of Baratie makes up about 90% of that content. So even though this arc was 2 episodes in the live action, what we actually saw was about a third of the content from the original, if that. I think that's being generous. But it's not just about missing out on big spectacle fights, and quite frankly, I do think that Don Krieg is a character that most fans would be okay cutting. He's probably the least memorable East Blue villain, but it's less to do with him and more about the impact of his decisions on those around him. One thing I guess I should make clear is that if you're not familiar, One Piece is what would be described as a battle manga. That means that fights are very common. In fact, fights are the main vehicle by which Oda tells the story. That might sound weird if you're not used to anime or manga, but if you are, then you know that, yeah, that makes perfect sense. Battles are primarily the places where characters develop. It's where they learn things about themselves and others. And what the One Piece live action had to do out of necessity was cut most of the battles, which means that it had to find other solutions for characters to actually develop. For example, Gin is a character that you may or may not remember from the live action. He just sort of pops in, Sanji feeds him, and we never see him again. And to many who do know One Piece, this is a big disservice to the character, because Gin is not just a member, but a commander of Don Krieg's crew. So when he turns up starving at Baratie, there's an understanding that Sanji is feeding an enemy. Gin's not just some dude in need. He's someone who represents a legitimate threat. And knowing that, Sanji still feeds him anyway, because that's his principle. And seeing that moment is what makes Luffy decide to recruit Sanji. But this has consequences, because feeding Gin allows him to go back and bring Don Krieg to the restaurant, who promptly decides to invade it. And throughout the ensuing battle, Gin becomes quite a complex character for East Blue One Piece, completely torn between his fierce loyalty to Don Krieg and Gin's admiration and respect for Sanji, who saved his life. And eventually Gin is given the opportunity to, but refuses to kill Sanji and effectively swaps sides, but also finds a way to remain loyal to Krieg and essentially ends up sacrificing himself to save Luffy. I say essentially because, look, we don't see him die, but it's pretty damn likely due to all of the poison he inhaled. So as much as I understand why it needed to be done for the sake of time, reducing a character like Gin to a random who stumbles into the kitchen for a minute is something that is very controversial within the fanbase. Because if anything, Gin is one of the most memorable parts of Baratie, if not East Blue as a whole. But this also comes with big consequences for Sanji, because the whole Baratie arc is about showing Sanji that his dreams are worth pursuing even if it involves putting your life on the line. It's a recurring motif that starts with Zoro versus Mihawk, which Sanji isn't actually present for in the live action. But in the manga, he sees Zoro willing to throw his life away and simply does not understand why. He also sees Gin willing to throw his life away over his loyalty loyalty to Don Krieg and again doesn't understand why. Then finally, he sees Luffy willing to put his life on the line to save a bunch of cooks he just met, and it's only after watching all of this that Sanji openly shares his dream of finding the All Blue. So the live action is a bit lacking in that regard, because Sanji doesn't see Zoro, Gin, or Luffy's determination. Luffy's being especially important because it's fighting and defeating Don Krieg that shows Sanji that Luffy is a captain worth following. In the live action, this whole thing is replaced by a quick skirmish with Arlong, which Luffy loses, and it doesn't really do anything to show Sanji that, yeah, Luffy is the right guy to leave with. The scene with Zeph is very good, and it's one thing to leave the restaurant to follow your dreams, but why pledge your loyalty to this specific rubber boy? It's just the sort of knock-on effect that happens when you remove 90% of a story and have to quickly and efficiently cobble something together to fill those gaps of character development. And what they did in the live action, I think it works well enough for a first-time viewer, but as someone who knows the series, I find Baratie pretty unsatisfying as a whole. Again though, sometimes cutting the big battles, it does work. I think they got around the Sanji thing fine, they did it fine. But here's an example of when it didn't work. Also removed from the live action was the Syrup Village invasion, and overall Syrup Village ended up being quite a claustrophobic arc. In the original series, almost nothing happens inside. There's a few scenes in Kaya's mansion, but the vast majority of the arc takes place on the coast of the island, with the Straw Hats fighting the Black Cat pirates, of which there are a lot of them. In the live action, we only see Captain Kuro, Sham, and Butchie, but there's supposed to be a whole crew of them invading the village on Kuro's command, including a fan favorite who was cut from the series named Django. And this was actually quite unexpected, because for the promotional events the live action held, they had walls of bounty posters, and one of the posters is actually Django, so we were very much expecting him to be in the show. TLDR though, Django is a hypnotist who has a quirk of often accidentally hypnotizing himself as well. He's a very quirky character, and even over 1,000 chapters into the story, he still pops up every now and then. Look, Django on his own probably isn't a big loss. It's not so much that his absence is felt for him, it's that the lack of Django is a pretty big loss for Usopp. Django is the vice captain of the Black Cat Pirates, and the man ultimately charged with killing Kaya. And whilst the Straw Hats were occupied with Kuro and the rest of the crew, it actually falls to Usopp to go and save Kaya, which is a massive moment for him, because he overcomes his cowardice and actually succeeds in defeating Django when it most matters. Something I don't think the live action does very well at all is establishing Usopp's cowardice. He's more just generally incompetent, but Usopp's entire dream is to become a brave warrior of the sea. And the reason why that seems just as impossible as Luffy becoming the Pirate King is because Usopp is the exact opposite of brave. I don't even think we have a word in English to describe how cowardly he is, but his whole drive to set out to sea is less about adventure and more about self-development. That's why he wants to leave Syrup Village, to become the brave warrior of the sea that he pretends to be in front of Kaya, and also to live up to the legend of his father Yasopp, who Usopp greatly admires. So robbing him of his hero moment as well as his moment of standing up to Kuro very much robs us of understanding why Usopp eventually joins the crew at all. As it is, Luffy saw Usopp doing some cool snipes in the kitchen, and I guess that was that. Large-scale village invasions are time and money intensive, so it got cut and streamlined. But unlike Sanji, the live action didn't find a good, or indeed any way, to make sure that Usopp still got the beats he needed. It's not all about fights though. Sometimes there are just ideas in the live action One Piece that had to be simplified for the sake of time. And a very common one that a lot of existing fans didn't take too kindly to was that in the live action, nobody knows about Nami's plan to buy back Kokoyashi Village, whereas in the manga, they all know. And they're just pretending to hate Nami so that she doesn't feel bound to the village. They want her to be able to leave and escape. And the idea that her sister Nojiko in particular hates her is a big departure. Because for those who know, Nojiko's tattoos make no sense now. She got those tattoos because Nami was ashamed of her Arlong pirate tattoo, so it was a show of solidarity. Nojiko is supposed to be the one person in this world who Nami can confide in, the only one that would welcome her home. And again, I get why this change was made, because it is a slightly more complicated idea to convey in the time they had, but it also brings up potential questions such as an entire village of adults willing to let Nami sell herself into servitude. If not done correctly, it could look pretty bad. And on paper, yeah, it's a very difficult idea to balance, and it really does take someone with the precise skills in the right medium to pull off, just like how Oda did it with the manga. And look, if the live action producers weren't confident that they could land to the idea that it might be for the best that they didn't try. But either way, it does remove a lot of the heart of Kokoyashi Village, and it turns Genzo and Nojiko into characters that I legitimately don't like. And then there's Garp. I'm not going to spend too much time on this because everything that can be said has been said in other videos, but Garp is actually in East Blue, but his plotline takes place as part of a cover story with Kobe and Helmeppo, almost none of which the live action chooses to adapt. They go in a completely different direction, integrating them with the Straw Hat story. The most wild Garp change is that you're not supposed to know that Garp is Luffy's grandfather until more than 400 chapters into the series or 300 episodes. So what they did here was borrow from a future arc called Water 7, where Garp does pursue the crew and throws cannonballs at them, etc. He even meets them on the island and does a big info dump. So it's not completely unfamiliar, but it does feel out of place. And in the best case scenario, if down the line we do get to Water 7, it makes me question, are we just going to replay these exact same beats again? But just as a character, Garp is probably the one who departs most from his manga self. In the live action, he is extremely serious, prone to tantrums, and honestly mildly incompetent. Whereas in the manga, Garp is at a point in his life where he's quite carefree. He's much more similar to Luffy. And in fact, he wasn't even going to chase after Luffy at all, but he got ordered to. And even then, he purposely gave a half-assed effort. There's probably nothing wrong with Garp to a first-time viewer, and I think it does provide an intriguing mid-series twist, but he's very jarring and quite controversial for those familiar with the character, especially in a series that otherwise does remain pretty incredibly faithful to the source material of One Piece. And as I've said in other videos, this is on the record as one of the changes that Oda really needed to be pushed into. He did not want to do the Garp plotline at first, and I personally think that we maybe should have heeded that hesitancy and tried to come up with another way around it. Because while I personally do think the idea is sound, the execution makes it the weakest element of the live action. But you let me know in the comments, what do you think was the most controversial change in live action One Piece?